Can you guys hear me okay? Awesome. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started because this is a lot of information to pack into a short period of time, and I don't want to have to rush through it. Should we close the door? Would someone mind? Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Simone. I'm an attorney with Southern Legal Counsel. We are a nonprofit, public interest, civil rights organization based out of Gainesville. We do statewide impact litigation and policy reform. I'm the director of our Transgender Rights Initiative, and I also serve as an attorney at Litem on the 8th Judicial Circuit for dependent children with special needs. Before law school or before becoming an attorney, I was a guardian ad litem volunteer, and before that, I was very sort of immersed in the foster care system and the dependency system because I grew up in a family that did foster care, and I had nearly 50 foster siblings growing up. So I was able to witness firsthand a lot of the unique issues that foster children face, and particularly that LGBTQ foster children face. So I'm really honored to be here today to talk to you guys about some of the best practice tips for representing LGBTQ youth in the dependency system, and specifically how to advocate for them in education proceedings. Okay. So I'd just like to start by saying, thank you guys for choosing this presentation. Thank you for being here. This is a safe space, so there are no dumb questions. There are no bad questions. Feel free to ask anything. We're all kind of in different places in our journey towards being culturally competent. I do this presentation, the cultural competency piece, all the time, and every single time I do it, I learn something new from the people I'm presenting to, from the youth that I work with. So we're all on this journey together. Just to sort of give you an idea of what we're doing today, we're going to talk about Florida's LGBTQ population. We're going to talk about some of the unique issues that trans and LGBTQ youth in the dependency system face. We're going to do a transgender cultural competency. We're going to talk about the laws that exist to protect LGBTQ youth, particularly in the education arena, and then some advocacy tips for representing and supporting trans students. And then we'll do a case study that sort of ties it all together. Just to be clear, I know that this was formerly called the Guardian Ad Litem Disabilities Conference. And so I was actually interested in doing a presentation like this the past couple of years, but there's always that fear of, are people going to then think that being transgender is a disability because I'm doing this at a disability conference? But I did an education for trans youth presentation at COPA, the National Special Ed Conference, and was able to explain that the stigma and anxiety and depression and psychological distress that many trans students face can actually manifest as a disability and impede their ability to learn and to function in school and elsewhere. So I just want to make it clear that I am in no way saying that being LGBTQ is a disability. And I'm really glad that we changed it to the Specialized Advocacy Conference, because this is definitely a special skill that people need. All right, so we're going to start with a little icebreaker. When it's a small crowd, I usually have everybody go, but this is way too many people. So if a few volunteers could raise their hand for me, what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you something true about myself that matches my gender identity, and then I'm going to tell you something true about myself that doesn't match my gender identity, and then I want a couple other people to do it, and I'll explain why. So something about myself that is true that matches my gender identity is I am very nurturing. I love babies. I love putting their face on my face. It's a very maternal, I think, nurturing, stereotypically female quality. Something about myself that doesn't match my gender stereotype is I hate the color pink, I hate shopping, won't wear dresses. So, can somebody raise their hand and do what I just did? Some brave soul? Yes. All right, perfect, hate shopping too. So we're twins, perfect. Not very girly. All right, anybody else? Yeah. Love sports, okay, good. Anybody else want to do? All right, so I start with that because it is so important if you're going to understand transgender, what it is to be transgender and these issues. You need to understand gender stereotypes, because the laws that protect trans individuals and trans youth stem from protections based on sex stereotypes. Sometimes people get uncomfortable doing this exercise because in order to do it, you have to acknowledge that you see stereotypes, and a lot of us don't. We say, oh, we don't see color, we don't see gender stereotypes. Well, we do. We're all human. We all know, the stereotypes associated with males and females. So the way that the law developed is really interesting. I'm not going to get super nerdy on you because I could talk just about sex discrimination law forever, but in Frontiero versus Richardson in 1973, the US Supreme Court took sex discrimination, which we think of as you can't treat males and females differently. They took it a step further, and they said that sex-based classifications were subject to heightened scrutiny because of the pervasiveness of gender stereotypes. So that was discussing a law where only female service members had to prove that their spouse depended on them in order to get marriage benefits. And then in US versus Virginia, most people know that case, they took it a step further and said it was subject to intermediate scrutiny because we can't rely on generalizations about the different aptitudes of men and women. So they couldn't say women can't go to this military college because they're not strong enough. That's based on sex stereotypes and generalizations about the aptitudes. And then in Price Waterhouse, the Supreme Court held that discrimination on the basis of gender stereotypes is sex-based discrimination because gender stereotyping includes failing to act or appear according to gender expectations. And then finally, Glenn versus Brumby in our own circuit, the 11th Circuit, held that discrimination against a transgender individual because of their gender nonconformity is sex discrimination, and said that the very acts that define transgender people as transgender are those that contradict stereotypes of gender-appropriate appearance and behavior. The boring part's over, I promise. But it's important to understand that sex stereotypes is a huge basis for the protections of trans individuals. So reflecting on our current awareness, think about, and we don't need to say it, but think about the first time you realized that not all people were heterosexual, and that some people identify as gay. The first time you realized that not everyone identifies as cisgender. And I should ask, do we know what cisgender means? Cisgender basically means not transgender. Your gender identity and your biological sex match. And then where did most of your influence come from? I have a lot of people who have a hard time understanding the transition process because their vision or their idea of what a transgender person is like Caitlyn Jenner, where anybody that doesn't look like that, it must not be finished. They must still be in progress. And it's really important to challenge those assumptions of what someone's journey is and what someone wants, and not everybody has the same goals in transitioning. How many of you guys have worked with LGBT youth? Awesome. What about transgender youth specifically? Transgender adults, okay. That's great, okay. So before we dive in, a few key terms. Who can tell me what these letters stand for? So say them out loud. L. Lesbian. G. Y'all don't even need me. All right, good. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and then what was Q? Or queer. Some older people sometimes, like my parents, are like, you can't say that word. But actually, you can. It used to be derogatory, and if people still find it derogatory, of course, respect that. But younger people have now sort of reclaimed that word and use it to define a whole host of gender identities and sexual orientations. And then if I added the letters IA to this, what does I stand for? Intersex and A? Or ally. Yes, we should all be A's. And any of the other letters as well. All right. Oh, sorry, I forgot. Okay, so transgender is the umbrella term for people whose gender identity does not match their sex assigned at birth, or whose gender identity or expression don't conform to predominant gender roles or stereotypes. Being trans has nothing to do with one's sexual orientation. So we conflate them because of the letters LGBTQ, and that's great. We're all a community, we're all fighting for rights, but the LGB and the T are separate and distinct, and we're going to get into that in a minute. Cisgender, again, are people who don't identify as transgender, whose sex assigned at birth corresponds to their gender identity. And then sexual orientation is an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, or sexual attractions to men, women, both, or neither. All right. So this is important because Florida has a ton of LGBT individuals. We have the third highest number of trans individuals in the country, yet we're still a state that lacks statewide protections for individuals, LGBT individuals, in housing, employment, and public accommodation. While there are counties that have human rights ordinances that protect individuals in these areas, we don't have a statewide protection. These are the numbers of people that have self-disclosed being LGBT, and particularly with the transgender number. Y'all can tell how nervous I am by this shaking can. I'm not gonna use the pointer, no more pointer. So what's important to know about this is a huge underestimation, because these are people who are comfortable enough to self-disclose their transgender status in a survey. And while it's anonymous, still many people would not be comfortable doing so. So anytime you see like estimated numbers of trans youth in the foster care system or trans youth and whatever, know that that's probably a much higher number than is reported. So the intersectionality of poverty, the trans community represents undoubtedly one of the most vulnerable and underserved communities, particularly legally. But 90% of trans individuals experience harassment, discrimination, and mistreatment at work. Nearly 30% of the trans population lives in poverty, which is twice the national average. And then the unemployment rate is 3 times the national average. Homelessness is rampant, and we're going to get into youth a little bit later, but just generally in the trans population, 1/3 of trans individuals report having experienced homelessness. That's an egregious number. Nearly 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBT. 40% of trans individuals have attempted suicide. That is 9 times the national average. And when I'm talking to parents of youth who are having a hard time, accepting and understanding their child when they're transitioning or they're having these feelings, this statistic makes people stop in their tracks, because the reason this number is so high, the reason that this many people attempt suicide, is the stigma attached to being trans, to being LGBT in our society, the lack of affirming and supportive structures in our society. I don't know what, it's an alarming noise. I don't know what that is. And then of homeless youth, 62% of LGBT homeless youth have attempted suicide, in contrast to 30% of their homeless non-LGBT peers. So we really need to be protecting this population. So then all the statistics I just showed you worsen and are compounded by the other intersecting systems of oppression. So when you add disability or race, ethnicity, class, religion, mental health status, etc., to the fact that the person is LGBT, all of these statistics worsen. So there is a big reason why the homelessness rates, the unemployment rates, the poverty rates are so high, is because it's really difficult to get a job or to get a house or to have stability when every time you show your driver's license or your passport or whatever identification document, it outs you and it has a different gender marker and a different name than how you identify. That makes your life really hard. Think about, I get carded every time I buy a drink. I get carded, makes it sound like I drink all the time. I get carded when I drink irregularly. I get carded, getting a car to come here, getting the hotel room. Think about how often we pull out our ID and show it, and we don't even think about it. Most of us don't think twice about it. But for individuals who have a gender marker and name on that ID that is not them, it does not reflect who they are, that is a terrifying and stigmatizing process every time. And, yeah, maybe they don't get the job they're applying for, they don't get the house, but also maybe they get murdered. The statistics for trans women of color that are murdered in Florida alone are so high. So there's so many negative implications of not having accurate ID. So why do people not update their IDs? It is not for lack of trying. It is a really difficult process. You have to fill out a petition and all these different forms, and it's different in all 67 counties. This is just for adults. For minors, they need the parent to fill out all the forms, which When we're dealing with foster youth, this is a very, very difficult process. There's a $400 filing fee. The parent or whoever's petitioning for the minor has to get a background check done, get fingerprinted. They have to request a hearing in front of a judge. And for, I'm from Archer, a tiny little town outside of Gainesville, and if you're in a small town and you go to open court publicly and out yourself in front of your town, that can be a really scary thing to do. So all of these things are barriers to people having identification documents that match their gender identity. So then you get all this done, all your documents do not automatically update. You then have to have a court order for name change, go to each of the different agencies to update your name. You got to get a doctor's letter swearing that you've undergone appropriate clinical treatment for gender transition, which means you have health care. You have a doctor you see regularly. That doctor is treating you for transition-related care. All of these are additional barriers to having identification that matches. And again, for foster youth, this can be nearly impossible. And if anybody's actually done this, has anybody helped change the name of a youth they represented? Yeah? Who petitioned for the youth? And what was your role? Guardian Litem attorney. And you have as well? Okay, so I've seen it done where the attorney ad litem is the one that petitions on their behalf, but there isn't really a set rule on how to go about doing this. Who's the legal guardian or parent for a yes? Right, those are great questions. So for the appropriate clinical treatment question, we've actually worked with the Department of Vital Statistics over the past 2 years to make this so that it's consistent across all documents. So in Florida, your birth certificate, driver's license, social security, and passport all have the same requirement, and it's this language. What that means is whatever a doctor decides is right for that person. So if that person has socially transitioned, meaning presenting with the gender and name and pronouns that they identify with, whether they have begun, counseling, whether they've done hormone replacement therapy, whether they've had surgeries, it doesn't matter. So the laws used to require sex reassignment surgery, which is an outdated and archaic thing to require, especially for youth who aren't usually allowed to have surgeries like that until after 18. And not everybody wants surgery, so requiring that is very limiting. So appropriate clinical treatment is whatever a doctor says it is. And then for appearing in court, it's within the family law division, but typically they'll have a name change docket where they'll have, it's a really quick hearing. And some counties don't actually require hearings, the judge will just sign, but most counties have a hearing process.
So it's not likely that if it's a youth, that the dependency court judge.
Right, no. It has to be on I believe, the name change docket. We could have a whole nother conversation on that, yes.
If you have a unified family court, then since this is considered a family law,
Mm-hmm.
change name, you can have the UFC dependency. If you have a UFC system.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Okay, so LGBTQ youth in care. Let's talk about some of the unique issues that they face. So LGBTQ youth are overrepresented in the child welfare system. While in care, they often face harassment and emotional, physical, and sexual abuse from everyone involved in the system. They're subjected to conversion or reparative therapies, and therapies is in quotation marks because it does not deserve the title of therapy. It is not scientifically based or evidenced to be effective. It is actually proven by every major medical association to be incredibly harmful and detrimental and traumatizing. Actually, the other night, Alachua County, my county, finally passed a conversion therapy ban for minors, which is awesome. But a lot of youth actually in the foster care system are subjected to this because there are so many faith-based placements and services, and oftentimes, unfortunately, the reparative therapy, Pray the Gay Away, comes from faith-based providers. A lot of times they're put into isolation. Sometimes this is well-intended. They're not sure where to put the youth, so they just put them separate so they don't have to force them to be with boys or girls. But this is actually really traumatizing. They're inappropriately placed, again, in sex-segregated placements that don't match their gender identity. Dead named and misgendered. Dead name means calling someone the name that they were given at birth that is no longer the name that they identify with. They're forced to dress in ways that allow no room for their gender expression. They're denied medically necessary treatment for gender dysphoria. Even for individuals with good health insurance and the means to see a doctor and the means to, seek the treatment they need, it's really difficult to find providers that specialize in transition-related care. So for youth in foster care, it's even more difficult. They experience blatant hostility and verbal abuse, and it's so common that many hide their sexual orientation or gender identity just to survive within the system. Oftentimes they emancipate or age out of foster care without any family connections or permanency. And then oftentimes they run away from unaffirming supportive placements and end up on the streets. So the cycle, and this is not all LGBTQ youth, it is just a cycle that is commonly seen. They're kicked out of their home initially for being LGBTQ and then placed into foster care, which is a system full of sex-specific facilities and regulations governing every aspect of a youth's life. So what clothes they wear, where they live, what doctor they see, what therapy they get. All of these things are dictated by others when you're in the dependency system. They're subject to inappropriate sex-segregated placements, unaffirming foster homes, isolation and discrimination, and then they're kicked out of or run away from the placements and end up homeless, and then experience violence or harassment on the street, no access to medical care. Oftentimes these youth are seeking, black market hormones because they can't afford hormone replacement therapy, and that can lead to a whole host of negative outcomes, and then oftentimes end up in the delinquency or adult jail system. So only 5 to 7% of youth nationally identify as LGBTQ, but they make up 25% of the youth in foster care, according to some studies. I know there's different numbers on this. 20% of those in the juvenile justice system, and nearly 50% of youth experiencing homelessness. So, all right, 40% of youth in care in some of these studies were forced to leave their home because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Of those, over 30% suffered physical violence at the hands of a family member due to their sexual orientation or gender identity, and then the same youth, that the reason they're placed into care is because of this, are then further harassed and abused. 78% of them further harassed and abused once they're placed in out-of-home care. So they're taken out of a bad situation and put into another bad situation. 70% of LGBTQ youth in group homes reported violence based on their LGBTQ status. And then nearly 80% in one study were removed or ran away from their foster placements as a result of hostility towards their sexual orientation or gender identity. So due to all those statistics we just mentioned, LGBTQ youth homelessness is awful. So 65% of 400 LGBTQ youth surveyed, I believe this was in New York City, had lived in a foster or group home. That's a lot. They're physically or sexually victimized by an average of 7 more people than non-LGBT homeless youth. 58% of LGBT homeless youth were the victims of sexual assault versus 30% of non-LGBT homeless peers. And then 56% were living on the streets because they reported they felt safer there than they did in their group or foster home. What does this tell us? The child welfare system as a whole is failing these youth. The fact that this many youth experiencing homelessness had been in child welfare previously and now they were homeless means, we have to do something different within the system. So some of the common myths that we hear from foster families, placements, from group homes, from caseworkers, etc., include that LGBTQ youth are more likely to act out sexually or to be sexual predators. One foster child said, after my foster mother found out that I was a lesbian, she told my social worker that she didn't want me in her house. She was afraid I would try something with her 12-year-old biological daughter. LGBTQ youth are no more likely to act out sexually than any other youth. They are not a danger or a risk to anyone else. Another is that all LGBTQ people have been traumatized or abused, and that's what's made them this way. Also very much false. Coming out as LGBTQ is a form of acting out. Actually, the contrary is true. Not having your gender identity or sexual orientation affirmed and respected causes children to act out far more frequently and to have issues with school, with placements, etc. And then LGBTQ youth sexual orientation or gender identity can be changed through reparative or conversion therapies. Again, like I said, this is absolutely untrue, and if you're seeing this happen, you should absolutely put a stop to it because it has no scientific basis whatsoever. All right, let's get into the cultural competency. So it's okay, like I said, if you don't know the terms I'm talking about, if you're not familiar with the lingo, or even if you don't necessarily agree with placing a child who was biologically, assigned female at birth in a male group home or vice versa. It's okay. All I'm asking is open heart, open mind moving forward with this. So cultural competency is commonly understood as a set of congruent behaviors, knowledge, attitudes, and policies. So I'm here to help with the knowledge aspect. I can't force you to change your own personally held beliefs or attitudes or the policies of your agency or organization, but I'm hoping that the knowledge will encourage that. Before we get into the terms, remember that this is not black and white. Also, we are working with youth. I do cultural competency presentations all the time. I am a trans rights attorney, and on a daily basis, I have people say, oh, I identify as, and they say a word, and I'm like, I've never heard of that, what is that? It is constantly changing, so just be open to how other people identify. And things that I say today might in a month be considered insensitive or outdated. This is just what I know right now in this area, and in all different geographic locations, things are different. So I used the gender-bred person to just sort of explain the differences between sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. If anybody is offended by the gender-bred person, I know there are advocates that do not like this. I apologize. It's just the best way that I've found to explain the differences in these things. So your sex assigned at birth is determined, you come out of the womb, and the doctor looks at you and makes a decision to mark M or F on your birth certificate, or I, intersex, based on basically your external genitalia. That is not the only thing that makes up sex, though. They can't see your chromosomes, your hormones, your gender identity, all of these other things. So your sex assigned at birth is basically just what a doctor decides by looking at your external genitalia. Who you think you are is your gender identity. And gender identity is actually, many believe, the primary determinant of sex. So you guys don't know my gender identity unless I tell you, right? What would you guys guess? Why? Say what? You've done this before. Yes, so if you make an assumption about my gender identity when I have not told you how I identify, it's only in my own head. If you make an assumption about that, you're making an assumption based on my gender expression, which is how I demonstrate who I am. So what about me makes you think that I'm female? Really nothing. Long hair, what else? Heels. Thank you, they're not that high. Makeup. Jewelry. Okay. So, what? Thank you. She said chest. Thanks for noticing. So my gender expression, this is the way that I'm expressing to you guys and the outside world and everyone I interact with. I'm expressing to you my gender. Now, gender expression is not always consistent. And I'm going to show you this a little bit later, but why might a person's gender expression not always match their gender identity? So if I identify as a female, and right now I'm expressing myself with, female attire, female, etc., why might someone not consistently express their gender in the same way? Right, so I have a client who for 20 years has identified as female. She has changed her legal name. She is identified strictly as female for literally 20 years, except at work, because she is afraid that she will lose her job if she expresses her female gender identity at work. So she still dresses male at work for the comfort of her coworkers and boss. She's been there for a very long time. So a lot of youth might not express the gender that they actually identify with full time because they might be afraid they'll be kicked out of the placement. They might be afraid they'll get bullied at school. There's a myriad reasons why someone's gender expression might not be the same in every situation or day to day. Okay, so I told you guys well, you guys kind of told me. My gender expression is female. I'll tell you my gender identity is female, and my sex assigned at birth was female. What does that tell you about my sexual orientation? Nothing. So my sexual orientation is lesbian, but you guys would not know that based on any of the other things I said. So my gender identity, my gender expression, and my sex assigned at birth, because these are separate and distinct concepts. Who you are attracted to has nothing to do with how you identify in terms of gender. All right, so a few sexual orientation terms. So heterosexual, people who are straight, who are attracted to members of the opposite gender. Gay typically describes men who are attracted to men, but could be women who are attracted to women as well. Lesbian typically describes women who are attracted to other women. Bisexual means you're attracted to both men and women. Asexual, you experience little or no sexual or romantic attraction to anyone. I think it's important when I say men who are attracted to men and women who are attracted to women, some women and some men. There is a sort of stereotype that gay men are going to be attracted to every man they see, and straight men, watch out, and gay women are attracted to every woman we see. No, just like everybody else, we have types, we have taste, we are not attracted to everyone. So don't think that a youth who identifies as gay is going to somehow be a harm to other males in a facility, or a youth who identifies as a lesbian is going to be a harm or more of a threat to other females in the facility. Some other important terms, so ally, we should all be allies. Someone who confronts and challenges heterosexism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. I think we all know what homophobia means, transphobia, and then outing. So we're going to get into this a little more later, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Outing the youth that you represent can be very dangerous. Remember that you don't follow them home at the end of the day, and while you might have good intentions in advocating for them and expressing that they are gay or trans or whatever, involuntarily and an unwanted disclosure of their sexual orientation or gender identity can be really dangerous for them and can follow them. So just keep that in mind. So sexuality is made up of three components. There's orientation, which is who you want, who you love. Behavior, which is what you do you act on it? And then identity is what you call yourself. And these don't always match up the way that one might expect them to. So for instance, in high school, I was super in the closet and I dated boys. Made my dad happy, I looked like everybody else. I was attracted to women and I knew that I was gay, but I dated boys. I identified, I told everybody, oh, I'm straight. So these three components didn't match up. So let's do a little quiz. I'm attracted to, this is not me speaking, by the way. I'm attracted to men and women, I sleep with men and women, but I identify as straight. What do you call this person? Ignoring that. You call them straight, because what matters is how someone identifies. It is their decision how they identify, regardless of how they feel or their behaviors. So it's important to respect, especially youth who have so little control over their world and their environment when they're in the dependency system, respecting their right to self-identify. If they say I'm straight, they're straight. If they say I'm gay, they're gay. Just respect the way that they identify. All right, transgender. So again, an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or expression differ from their sex assigned at birth. And remember, this is an adjective. So transgendered means something happened to the person to make them that way, and that's not true. It's just a normal human condition. And then transgenders as a noun is also incorrect. And then TG and C is a common term used to describe transgender and gender non-conforming. You might see that, and we're going to get into gender non-conforming, but that's what that means. Oftentimes people ask me, what about the term transsexuals? It's kind of outdated. If someone identifies as transsexual, great, you mirror that language, but typically it's kind of an outdated term that was used in the medical and psychological fields to describe someone who is transitioning. All right. Non-binary. A lot of youth these days are identifying as non-binary. So what it means is they don't feel that they fit neatly within one of the two options in our society. We have a binary that says you're either male or female. And sometimes these people also identify as trans, sometimes they don't. the notion that there's only two genders that are solidly fixed and unchangeable is sort of becoming a thing of the past. Some non-binary people see themselves as a mix between male and female, some view themselves as neither, and some have no relationship to gender at all. In a National Center for Trans Equality survey, 35% of the respondents said they identified as non-binary. 4.5% of youth ages 12 to 17 identified as gender non-conforming or non-binary. And then some other terms that you might hear are gender neutral, gender fluid, gender variant, gender non-conforming, and two-spirit. So again, it doesn't matter if you necessarily know what any of these things mean, just respect the person's right to identify that way. So gender nonconforming is a very common term that people use when their biological sex is not congruent with their gender identity or expression. So to illustrate this is me at 12 with my dad. I'm the one on the right, just so we know. For the first 16 years of my life, I expressed myself in a strictly gender nonconforming way. I could not be made to wear girl clothes if you held me down and forced me. My parents tried. I was very, very much gender nonconforming for 16 years. I didn't identify as trans. I knew I was a girl. I liked being a girl, but I didn't want to dress like a girl. So this is how I dressed. Once I got into high school and things got a little harder, I became more gender conforming. And now, you know, when I'm at work, I'll wear a tight suit, I'll wear heels, I'll wear whatever. But then outside of work, this is me at Pride with this guy. We're going to get into this later, but he helped me develop the website, FloridaNameChange.org, where you guys can all help your clients change their names and update their gender markers, etc. But anyway, this is to express that gender nonconformity and gender expression are not always constant. You might see me right now dressed a certain way, and then tonight a different way. So people express their genders differently at different events, at different times of day, with different people. And I'm not going to get on a soapbox about it, but gender kind of is a social construct. When a baby comes out, they don't intrinsically like blue or pink. They don't automatically like trucks or dolls. We teach a little girl how to be a little girl, and we teach a little boy how to be a little boy. We teach them what things to like. We teach them stereotypes. But gender is not like a biological thing. All right, coming out. So this is the process of disclosing one's sexual orientation or gender identity to others. It is important to know that the youth that you work with, and just people in general, they don't owe you anything. You don't deserve to know this very personal, intimate detail. So I came out to all of you 10 minutes ago. This feels like a safe space. Would I come out at the hardware store in my hometown? Probably not. They haven't exactly earned that trust. I wouldn't feel comfortable doing so. So don't think that the youth that you work with, owe it to you to tell you their sexual orientation or gender identity. Trust has to be earned, respect has to be gained before they tell you this very intimate detail. Coming out is a lifelong process because it's presumed that everyone is heterosexual and cisgender. People oftentimes have to come out over and over and over, like I just did today, I did yesterday. It happens. So respect that when someone trusts you with that information. All right, trans youth. So I work with a lot of parents of trans youth who are working on updating their kids' documents. It can be a lot easier to enter school as the gender the child identifies rather than wait till later and then try to update their records. But I get people asking me, like, how could someone know at 5 or 8 what their gender identity is? And according to the DSM-5 and the APA and all of the major medical associations, gender identity is typically pretty fixed between, or children begin expressing it between 2 and 4 years old. By like 8, gender identity is typically pretty fixed. And this isn't like I was a tomboy as a kid or, I like dolls as a kid. This is a persistent and insistent feeling. I had a client who told me that her daughter at 3, 4 years old started telling her, I'm a girl, call me she, tell me I'm beautiful, I'm a girl. This child was born, male. And they were like, yeah, kind of humoring the kid and going along with it at home, but not really thinking much of it. And then when she was 5, she grabbed her mom's hand when her mom got to school, marched her over to the teacher and said, tell her that I'm a girl. And the mom was kind of like, ugh. And she was like, tell her that I am a girl because she keeps calling me a boy and I don't want to come back here. And was very clear. And the mom made me cry, but she said she called her husband and said, we have a daughter. So children do know, oftentimes. So to alleviate the distress that kids face when they feel like they're stuck in the wrong body, that the body that they're living in does not belong to them, allowing them to socially transition. So we're not up here advocating for like 5-year-olds to have surgeries, obviously, but allowing the child to socially transition, to dress in a way that matches their gender identity, to go by, she pronouns instead of he pronouns, to just live in all aspects consistent with that gender can be so incredibly beneficial for their mental and emotional stability. Puberty deferment, which is hormone blockers, very, very expensive, very difficult to get, even for people with really good insurance, but they can be really beneficial to help trans youth to not develop the secondary sex characteristics associated with their sex assigned at birth while they figure out, do they want to transition? All right, so language, of course, the language that you use can either immediately put your client at ease or can make them feel like you are not a safe place, you are not a safe person to disclose these things to. Labels and assumptions, of course, can have a really negative impact. Mirroring language. If you only take one thing away from this presentation, let it be that. Reflect the language back at the kids that you work with. Reflect the language that they use back at them. It doesn't matter if you understand it or if you think it's, you're probably not actually gay, you're probably confused, or you're probably not, it doesn't matter. Just reflect the language they use back at them and respect how they identify. And insider language, I know I probably shouldn't need to say this in 2019, but just because someone refers to themselves with one of these terms like dyke or fag or any of that insider language, the same kind of thing that we see, with race. Sometimes insider language, talking about your own community and about yourself, is different than other people using that language who are not part of that community. If you don't know which pronoun a person uses, you can use they, but the best thing to do is just ask. No one's going to be offended. Well, I shouldn't say no one. People are offended by a lot of things, but typically people who are gender non-conforming or non-binary or trans will not be offended if you ask them, what pronoun would you like me to use? What name do you identify with? And a really, really good way to alleviate this issue altogether is, I have it in my signature block, Simone, Chris, blah, 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 attorney, whatever it says, pronouns, she, her, hers. And when I introduce myself to a new client, whether they're trans or not, it's just a habit now, I say, hi, my name's Simone. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And at first it was a little awkward. I had trouble with it. And other people think it's awkward. But once you start doing it, what it does is it normalizes the fact that not everybody uses the pronouns that you assume when you look at them. And it creates this safe space where people, so the second that I say to someone, my pronouns are she, her, hers, they immediately know that they can tell me, oh, mine are he, him, his. These are the pronouns I use. And now I've opened this dialogue, it is a safe space, and you know that I'm culturally competent. And worst case scenario, if it's a cisgender heterosexual person, they might be like, huh? Yeah, okay. No harm, no foul. Okay, now they know that you definitely identify as she. And it's okay to make mistakes. Know that some people intentionally, as a form of emotional abuse, will intentionally misgender and dead name a person over and over and over as a way of showing them I'm not okay with this. I don't think any of you in this room would do this, and if you make a mistake, if you've known a kid by one name or one pronoun and you accidentally keep referring to them as the other, just apologize. Say, I'm really, really working on it. I'm sorry. I've just known you as, and tell them, people understand. So I practiced this presentation when I first started doing it on my dad, because he barely could understand what gay was when I came out. So when I started talking to him about trans, he was like, nope, don't get it. Don't even try. So when I got to this slide, he was like, seriously? And so I used this slide just to say, you don't have to know every term. You don't have to have flashcards for all the definitions. Just, again, know that some people identify these ways and just be accepting. So transition is the period in time in which a person begins to live in the gender role in accordance with their gender identity. And again, the reason live is in quotes is, like I said earlier, not everybody has the ability to live full time in the gender with which they identify. They may be afraid of losing their job, getting kicked out of their home, facing intimate partner violence, coming out to their partner that they actually identify differently. And so transition can include changing name and pronouns, changing clothes, growing their hair out, cutting their hair, wearing makeup, starting hormone therapy or surgeries, etc. And again, you guys can imagine for foster youth, sometimes this is even more difficult. They don't exactly always have as much access to, totally different wardrobe than they had before, things like that. A lot of things are controlled by others. So social transitioning is, clothes, going by pronouns, name, the way you present. Medical transitioning can include counseling, hormone therapy, surgeries, etc. And then legal transitioning, updating your legal documents to match. There's so many barriers to transitioning, and for foster youth, access to affirming placements, access to medical care for transitioning, access to clothing that matches their gender identity, and then the ability to change their name and gender marker are just a few. Gender dysphoria. So when we get a little bit later into the educational advocacy and utilizing the federal special education laws to represent trans youth, it's important that you guys understand gender dysphoria. This used to be called gender identity disorder. But gender dysphoria, being transgender is not in and of itself a disorder or a disease. The psychological distress and anxiety and depression that many people feel as a result of being trapped in the wrong body and living in a world where gender is so important and you don't match the gender you were assigned, that can rise to a clinically significant level to warrant a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Not all trans individuals have gender dysphoria. Some people don't experience the distress and the anxiety and the depression, and they're just kind of okay with the fact that they don't match, their gender identity and their sex assigned at birth don't match. But because we live in the United States, and oftentimes you need a formal diagnosis to get treatment, there's this kind of debate between, should we inappropriately pathologize something that's kind of just a normal variant of gender, which is, being transgender is not a disorder, but at the same time we need a clinical diagnosis to warrant health coverage or health insurance covering treatment. So it's kind of a tricky thing, but understand that gender dysphoria is something you can be diagnosed with, and it's just the symptoms of not having your gender identity affirmed or being stuck in the wrong body. If you have a youth you are representing who is trans and they're interested in transitioning, really look at the WPATH standards of care. WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. This is the gold standard. This is what the courts recognize as the authoritative standards for transitioning. In the same way that chemo is a medically necessary treatment to treat cancer sometimes, transitioning is a medically necessary treatment for trans individuals experiencing gender dysphoria. Okay, who can tell me what white privilege is? Nobody has ever heard of white privilege. Right. Anybody? Okay, what else? Systemic inequality. A big part of white privilege is never having to think about the fact that you have white privilege, right? It's not something that we're constantly conscious of. Cisgender privilege is the same. It's being able to use the restroom without fear of verbal abuse, physical intimidation, or arrest. Being able to use public facilities without worrying that somebody's going to tell you you don't belong or kick you out. Strangers don't assume they can ask you what your genitals look like or how you have sex. And your validity as a human is not based on how well you pass. So these are privileges that cisgender people who happen to have been lucky enough to be born with a gender identity and biological sex that match just have. So again, ask people what name and pronoun they use. Ask someone, what was your assigned at birth sex, or what was your sex assigned at birth, or what was your legally designated sex, not are you a boy or a girl. It acknowledges that a person was born that way but may not identify that way. Don't say, have you had the surgery? There is not one surgery that makes you officially a man or a woman or trans officially. Ask what gender do you identify with? Ask what name do you want me to use? And again, introducing yourself with pronouns can be so incredibly beneficial and really open up the dialogue. All right, so best practices We're just going to go through a few of these because the focus of this really is the education advocacy. But just for best practice in terms of working with trans youth and LGBTQ youth, adopting and implementing written policies prohibiting discrimination specifically on the basis of gender identity and gender expression. A lot of policies have sex, and yes, the courts have defined sex and made that so that it means sex stereotypes, gender nonconformity, and transgender status, but explicitly having protections based on gender identity and expression is so important. Ensure effective child protection practices that correctly identify abuse and neglect. I have a client who has a trans daughter, and they were simply letting her at 4 or 5 identify the way that she identified. They were just allowing her to dress the way she wanted and play with the toys she wanted. And a neighbor called DCF on them for forcing their child to be gay. And I've heard of many stories where someone affirming their child's sexual orientation or gender identity has been perceived as abuse by others, that they're telling their kid to be gay or forcing them to be trans or whatever. And they were investigated, and it was really, really difficult for their family. But at the same time, the converse of that is recognize when an LGBTQ youth is being abused at home. Conversion therapy is abuse. Trying to force a child to be something they're not and not affirming and respecting their identity can rise to the level of abuse. So understanding that is important. Ensure effective services that address family rejection of LGBTQ youth. So oftentimes LGBTQ youth who are kicked out of their homes or abused because of their status as gay or lesbian or trans, they don't end up being reunified because people don't think to provide counseling and training and such to the parents to help the parents understand that the child is who the child is, that, you know, having family therapy where the child in a safe environment can express, I've always been this way, I can't help it, it's part of who I am, and having a professional, a mental health or medical professional explain, there's nothing wrong with your child, this is a totally normal human condition. Providing mandatory LGBTQ cultural competency trainings to all agency employees and volunteers, as well as foster and adoptive parents, not just the ones that are like, we specifically are a gay-friendly foster home. Make sure that all foster homes and all group homes are trained in these things, because you never know when a kid's gonna be placed there who may not have come out to anyone yet, but they do identify as LGBTQ, and you don't want them in a home where they're gonna be told that who they are is wrong. Again, ensure safe and supportive placements. Ensure the availability of appropriate counseling services and physical and mental health. I know that this is tough. It's hard to even find, I don't want to use the word regular because that sounds stigmatizing, but any mental health counselor or doctor or, sometimes with youth in care, it's hard to find them a consistent provider at all. So to then have to find a provider that also specializes in transgender, transitioning, things like that, it can be really tough, but that's what that child needs, and it's really important to find them those services. Support access to safe educational services and necessary supports. We're going to get way more into that later, but making sure that they're safe at school and that they're being affirmed at school. Having a resource list and community contacts, so making sure that in each county you at least know where are the PFLAG meetings, where is the trans support group meeting, how can we get this kid in contact with resources that can help support and affirm them even if their placement might not necessarily be able to do so. Providing meaningful, confidential sex health education and services. Just in foster care in general, there's a lack of sex ed, this kind of education, but not assuming that every single child is straight and cisgender when you're providing this counseling, making sure to include, everybody in it. Creating a positive physical environment, we're gonna talk about how to do this, but simply having a non-discrimination statement posted or a gay pride flag up on the wall can be really, really helpful for youth who don't feel safe. And then ensuring access to LGBTQ mentors and role models. Like all youth, LGBT youth need adult role models and mentors. They need positive, adults to look to for how to be, how to live, what to do. And so making sure that those types of role models are a part of the system and that you have, Guardian Litem volunteers that are LGBTQ that you can, pair up with kids so that they have mentors. All right, sex-segregated facilities. This is tough. So I just did a training last week for the Orange County, or the North Central Florida Continuum of Care in Orlando, which are the housing and homeless services providers. And we were talking about access to emergency shelters in accordance with the gender identity that the gender that a person identifies with, not their sex assigned at birth. And with youth, that's also so important, not placing someone that identifies as a girl in a facility with all boys if that's not where they're going to feel comfortable. You are subjecting them, setting them up to way more abuse and violence and bullying and discrimination. Make individual decisions based on the physical and mental well-being of the youth, their level of comfort and safety, the degree of privacy afforded. So is it a room where there's 10 beds and everybody's together, or are there individual rooms with doors that lock? The types of housing available and the recommendations of a qualified mental health professional. So it's important not to just simply automatically defer to isolating or segregating the trans youth because it's too confusing to put them with boys or girls. Sometimes a youth will tell you, yes, I identify as male, but I don't want to be in a male facility with a bunch of guys. I still present, sort of female, or I'm worried about sexual assault, etc. So take the youth's, comfort and personal feelings of safety into account. Don't make decisions on their behalf without, including them in the decision-making process. Advocacy tips. So you can ask for findings that reasonable efforts have not been made to secure a safe and stable placement if the child is in an unsupportive and unaffirming environment, or in a sex-segregated facility that does not match their gender identity and they're experiencing distress and such as a result of that. Identify appropriate placements for LGBTQ youth. Look for unambiguous non-discrimination, anti-harassment policies. Make sure that the staff of the facility have been trained on LGBTQ issues, etc. Be prepared to rebut arguments with social science research that makes clear that lack of acceptance and conversion therapy and all of these things are hurtful and harmful and discriminatory. And then advocate for youth to receive, again, competent and affirming mental health and medical services, including access to hormones. Another thing is confidentiality. So oftentimes, lawyers are the only people that a youth will disclose their status to because, lawyers say that what you say to me is confidential. We have attorney-client privilege. I won't tell anyone. So it's important to explain confidentiality to your client, and then they might tell you things. They might be less willing to withhold information that is important to their safety. For example, a youth that's being physically assaulted in his placement due to his sexual orientation may not disclose this if he thinks that information is going to cause him to be kicked out of the placement or to not be able to be placed again because he's gay. So, letting them know that there is confidentiality around that relationship is really important. And like I said before, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Don't out a youth. Most of the youth that we work with that are identifying as LGBTQ are old enough to self-advocate and to tell you whether or not they're comfortable with their LGBTQ status being disclosed. Remember that you might have good intentions and you know that the placement they're in right now is affirming, so it's okay to say it in court, but now it's on the record and the next placement they go to might not be so affirming. So make sure that you're including them in that decision in whether or not to out them. And then, model rules of professional responsibility 1.6, you can't disclose, personal, private, confidential information about someone without their consent, and that goes for youth as well. So, but what do you do? So I've had people ask me when I talk about this, well, what do you do if they're being harmed? What do you do if you know that they're suffering negative repercussions and you need to tell someone this child is gay and they're being bullied for being gay? You can talk to the social worker or the caseworker about a change in placement without necessarily saying it's because of this. They're being bullied, period. It doesn't matter why. Or, if a client's peers at school are causing them harm and bullying them based on their LGBTQ status, you don't necessarily need to tell the principal or the teacher, oh, it's because they identify as trans, but this person's being bullied and harassed. They need to be moved out of this class, or the bullying needs to be addressed. So this is so important. When a youth comes into your office or into judges' chambers or anywhere where they're interacting with you, just having a little gay pride flag or a pink triangle or this is the this is the trans flag, and this is the lesbian pink triangle is the gay pride flag. Just something simple like this, small, it doesn't matter, up on the wall, I promise you they will notice it. It might not make a difference to 99% of the people that come in your office, they don't even notice it, but I promise you that person that's nervous about coming out to you, that person that's nervous about whether or not you're affirming, that's gonna mean the world to them just seeing that, whether it's on your website or on the wall, etc. And then having a visible non-discrimination statement is really important that includes the words gender identity and expression. Everybody has innate and unconscious or maybe conscious biases. It's important that we don't let them affect our advocacy. It's okay if you personally don't agree with homosexuality or transgender, being transgender, transitioning, etc. But you can't let that affect your advocacy of these youth. So the Model Code of Judicial Conduct says that a judge shall not manifest prejudice, bias, or based on race, sex, or sexual orientation. And remember that sex is defined in case law to mean transgender status. And then Rule 8.4 of the Model Rules of Professional Conduct for Lawyers, again, you cannot knowingly manifest bias. So remember that not only is this the right thing to do and you should do it because you're awesome, but also you have to. All right, I actually have this in a handout, and if people want to take it later, they can. I think it's a good way to, with people in your organization or office that you're working with, sometimes it's tough to talk about, like, I kind of think you're a bigot, or like, I kind of think that you're, like, you're kind of racist, you're kind of homophobic. So maybe just handing them this, or judges that you work with that you see kind of not affirming youth's identities, or maybe consistently dead naming and misgendering a kid after you've already expressed to the judge, my client I know that the record shows their name is blank, but they identify as blank. Using this as a tool of, asking someone, where do you think you fall on this? There's a range of attitudes towards, and this says about homosexuality, but also transgender, LGBTQ, IA, etc. All the way from repulsion, which is, whatever it takes to change them. We just need to change this. This is not okay. It's a crime against nature. To pity, which is, becoming straight should be reinforced. I feel bad that they feel this way, but this is not okay. Tolerance. A lot of people think that this should be the bar. Like, oh, I'm very tolerant. Well, that's not great. I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be accepted. I want to be affirmed. Tolerance is sort of like, it's a phase. I don't care that you're gay. I love you anyway. We don't want to be tolerated. We want, well, I said that, but then acceptance is up here too. So acceptance, I guess, still implies, like it says, that there's something to accept. And that, people say things like, you're just a person to me. It doesn't matter your sexual orientation, or what you do in bed is your own business. We're trying to move past acceptance and tolerance toward, affirming. So supporting, like advocating for the rights of gays and lesbians. Admiration, I think that's a strange word. I didn't make this. This is from the ABA's publication called Opening Doors for LGBTQ Youth in Foster Care. And then appreciation and nurturance. And nurturance is being, an ally and an advocate and letting the person know that you think that they are a meaningful, individual in our society, and that you think being being open about their LGBTQ status is brave. So, asking people kind of where they fall along this might open their eyes to their own maybe prejudices or biases. All right, so students specifically, 77% of students who were out or perceived as transgender while in school experienced mistreatment. So 54% were verbally harassed, 24% physically attacked, and 13% sexually assaulted during K through 12. In fact, 17% experienced such severe mistreatment that they left school as a result. 75% of trans youth feel unsafe at school. This leads to all of these things, missing class, lower GPAs. And it's insane to me how many students that are trans avoid gender-segregated spaces. That means using the bathroom, boys or girls' bathroom. They'll hold it all day long and end up with bladder infections, UTIs, all sorts of things because they're afraid to use the sex-segregated restrooms. 75% avoid school functions. Think about prom and homecoming and how important, school sports are, and being on teams, the debate team, the chess team, whatever it is, how important all of these things are. I do realize the chess team probably isn't sex segregated. I don't play a lot of chess. But think about all the things that are sex segregated at school and how missing out on those is such an important part of like your social development in high school. And so if students are avoiding all of these things, they're not gonna have the same opportunities as everyone else. The most common forms of discrimination that trans kids face at school are dead naming, misgendering, bullying and harassment, disclosure of confidential information, enforcement of unreasonable application of school dress code, meaning no variance in, so it's one thing to have a dress code and say this is the boys' dress code and this is the girls' dress code, that's fine. Schools can have dress codes. But if this person identifies as a male, they should be expected to follow the male dress code. If they identify as female, the female dress code. And then discriminatory policies surrounding bathroom use, locker room use, participation in athletics and extracurriculars, and involvement in gendered activities such as prom and homecoming. Oh man, we are not doing great on time. So sorry. All right, so this is just a case that shows how this stuff can really prevent a student from receiving an appropriate education. This case, Joe versus Yanchis, was a trans girl, was repeatedly disciplined, sent home, expelled from school for wearing feminine clothing and using the girls' restroom. She ended up missing so many days that she failed a grade. So what laws protect these kids? Before we can jump into best practices, we need to know what the laws say. So Florida's actually doing really good. We're not usually super cutting edge. We're not usually on the forefront of like progressive things. Very rarely am I like, I'm from Florida, yay. But when it comes to youth, foster youth, and out-of-home care and group care, we actually have some very good rules. So we include gender, gender identity, gender expression, and transgender in our definitions. That's huge. There's only like 3 states in the country that actually do this. I think we're with Oregon and California. Look at us go. For the individual needs of children in care, they are supposed to have personal hygiene and grooming that matches their gender identity and expression, involving them in the process of buying their clothes, not restricting items based on a child's gender identity, saying, oh, we actually can't give you makeup because you're a boy. Don't assume what a person needs. We have, you guys can read these later, they're in the materials, but there's rules prohibiting discrimination on the basis of transgender and gender identity and expression. Cultural competency, like the one I'm doing now, on sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression is required for individuals that are having direct child care or direct contact with children. And this is the most important one. For trans youth, when you're determining where to place them, these are the factors that need to be considered. And so getting recommendations from the guardian ad litem, from the case manager, from the therapist, assuming the therapist like understands what trans is and knows the child's needs. Okay, so IDEA in section 504. Raise your hand if you've ever advocated for kids in special ed proceedings. Okay, so these are really, really helpful tools I found in representing trans youth. If they already have an IEP plan or an IEP or a 504 plan, then you can actually have accommodations to assist them in their transition, allow them access to the appropriate bathroom, insist that they be called by the name that they identify with and the pronouns that they use into their IEP or their 504 plan as reasonable accommodations so that this child can function at school. If they do not already have an IEP or 504 plan, they can qualify for one because of their diagnosis of gender dysphoria or because of the anxiety, depression, and psychological distress they face as a result of not having their identities affirmed at school. So the IDEA, the 2 most common, you have to qualify under one of the disabilities listed. The 2 most common that trans individuals can qualify under are emotional disability or other health impairment. And all that really has to be shown is that it's impeding their ability to learn. When you are so afraid that teacher is going to call you your dead name and out you in front of the whole class, or you're too afraid to go to the bathroom that you're sitting there holding it all day long, you are not focusing on what the math teacher is saying. You are not accessing the education that you need. So having accommodations in either of these plans that allow an individual to use the bathrooms that they need to use, to have their name changed in the system, all of those things can be really helpful. All right, I'm so sorry about being behind on time, but I'm going to rush through these. So Title IX is the federal law banning sex discrimination. Courts have made it clear that you cannot discriminate against trans kids in schools. Gavin Grimm's case, Ash Whitaker's case, Drew Adams' case, the most recent Boyertown case. Kids are allowed to use the bathroom that matches their gender identity. I'm asked all the time, what about Trump administration rescinding the Obama era guidance about gender identity? Doesn't matter, because the courts are interpreting the plain language on the face of the statute. You can't discriminate on the basis of sex. Doesn't matter what the federal government thinks about trans kids, sex means gender identity, it's not allowed. Equal Protection Clause also protects on the basis of gender identity and transgender status. The Due Process Clause, youth in care have an affirmative right to protection from harm. They have the right to safety, meaning appropriate services, medical care, and safe placements. FERPA, this is really important. If you guys are representing trans youth and they can't get a name change, they don't have, a legal guardian or parent who can petition for the name change, and you can't figure out a way to do it, you can still argue that under FERPA, the Family and Education Rights and Privacy Act, that their name should be changed on every document. The only ones that the schools really can't are their standardized tests and their, what's the other one? Standardized tests and, does it say up there? Anyway, there's two things that they won't change it on, but everything else it should be changed. And what you argue is, that, oh, we're not there yet. So you argue that it's outing them. So by having their dead name, their legal name, and their former gender marker, their former the gender that the sex they were assigned at birth, by having that on any document, by having it in the yearbook, by having it anywhere, you are outing that child and you are violating their privacy, because their transgender status and their sex assigned at birth and their dead name are private, confidential, protected information. The ADA is not a great way to advocate for trans rights because the ADA specifically excludes gender identity disorders. However, stay tuned, case law is evolving on that. Okay, so now the advocacy tips. So argue that learning is a major life activity determined by the case law. If a student's ability to learn is being impacted by their gender identity not being affirmed, by their gender dysphoria, they can qualify. Make sure that the assessment is done by someone who is culturally competent, who understands the needs of trans students. They're entitled to an assessment by a culturally competent individual. So some of the accommodations that you can ask for are using the student's chosen name and pronouns, allowing access to the bathroom that matches their gender identity, providing stress breaks throughout the day. If the kid's getting overwhelmed and they need to walk to the water fountain, they need to walk away, that can be written into the IEP or 504 plan. Assigning a staff member who the student feels comfortable with, who knows that their LGBTQ status is really helpful. Arrange for counseling if the student needs that. Homebound or online services for a limited period if they have school aversion. And then providing a functional behavior assessment and a behavior plan to get the student back in school if things have been so bad that they have developed school aversion and they don't want to go. Okay, this is what I was talking about. So FERPA says that a record must be amended if the information is inaccurate, misleading, or in violation of the student's privacy rights. So argue that due to the incredibly high levels of discrimination that trans individuals face by a school outing students on any of their documents and their email communications, by calling out their name on the roll, etc., by outing a student, they are risking that student's privacy and violating that student's privacy. So when they've updated their name by a court order, obviously the school needs to change it, and you need to ask for them to retroactively update all of their records so that when they go off to college and they've transitioned and they no longer identify, the way they used to, the school's not seeing like two different humans and then they're outed in college for no reason. Okay, so there's so many places where students can be outed. I learned this the hard way. I represented a young man who it was so difficult to get all of this changed. The school insisted on having a birth certificate that said his gender was male. We finally went through the whole process, got his birth certificate updated his name on everything, did everything right, and then the frickin' yearbook came out and it said his dead name right there. Whole school didn't know because he transitioned between middle school and high school. Whole school knew he was trans because his dead name appeared in there. So it's so important to think through all the different places where a person's name or gender might be shown. Many districts around the country have found really interesting solutions to this. So if they tell you there's administrative barriers, we can't change the name, we can't choose whatever, that's not true. Lots of schools are doing this. these are just examples of things that schools have done. So in terms of non-discrimination policies and best practices policies, I'm just going to flip through these. You guys have them in your PowerPoint, but if you're trying to encourage a school to adopt affirmative policies, not just on behalf of your child that you represent, but on behalf of all the children in that school who might not have an advocate or a voice, getting them to change their policies is so helpful. So these are the best practices for what policy should say. And what's really important with this, I just want to point out, is if there is a fear or someone is uncomfortable with using the bathroom, it doesn't matter if it's the trans person who's uncomfortable using the boys' restroom or the girls' restroom. You can offer them, or the school can offer them, an alternative restroom. So the nurse's room, the clinic, a non-gendered bathroom. But it doesn't have to be the trans kid that uses that bathroom. If there's another student that's like, whoa, I'm not using the bathroom with a trans kid, okay, good, you can use the alternate bathroom. Make sure that we're not creating policies that just stigmatize the trans youth. If someone in a shelter is uncomfortable sleeping near someone who identifies as transgender or LGBT, we don't kick the LGBT kid out who's not causing any problems. We offer that person a reasonable accommodation. Oh, you don't want to sleep by them? You can sleep somewhere else, or you can use this other bathroom. Same with locker rooms. Florida actually has a good policy regarding our high school athletic association policy, and that's that all eligible students should have the opportunity to participate in athletics in a manner that is consistent with their gender identity, irrespective of what's listed on their birth certificate. So that's awesome. Okay, we already talked about that. Anti-bullying policies. And then remember, there's other gendered activities like overnight trips and being able to run for homecoming king, even though you were assigned the sex female at birth, you identify as male. Cheerleading, after school activities, all of these things. Remember from that earlier slide, 75% of these LGBTQ youth are avoiding sex-segregated activities. Think about ways that you can make all of these more inclusive, and you can make sure that kids are getting the best possible experience out of school. So, real quick case study. This is a youth I represented. He was in 10th grade. He had transitioned in the 8th grade. The school refused to call him by the name and pronouns with which he identified. They forced him to use this clinic bathroom, which, I'm not kidding you, he had to walk past 2 or 3 sets of male, female, male, female, male, female. He had to go to the front office and get this big orange pass each time he wanted to go to the bathroom. That's really not stigmatizing. I had a hard time in high school, and I was not a trans kid. So imagining being a trans youth who's also in the foster care system, all the stigma that you already face, and then having to walk around with a big orange pass. He had to decide, do I miss 10 minutes of class to go all the way to the front office and get this and then go to the bathroom, or do I just hold it? And so this resulted in school refusal behaviors. He didn't want to go. He would call his mom at lunch every day and want to check out. He was failing classes. He was super behind. So we began representing him. We did the legal name change and all of that, updated all of his records. We requested an evaluation for an IEP, and he qualified. He didn't formerly have any disability that was diagnosed, but because of the anxiety and stress and fear that he was experiencing at school, he qualified for an IEP under the EBD, emotional behavioral disability. The accommodations included, he got to have lunch. Was a horrible time for him. He hated lunch, but every day he got to go to this one teacher that had a free period, who really understood him and got what he was going through. He got to eat lunch in there, and that was written into his IEP. We ensured that when there's a substitute, when they get that role, it definitely says his current name, not his dead name, so that he doesn't, he would literally freak out when there was a sub, and he'd skip class because he knew they were going to call out the wrong name. And then eventually we sent a demand letter to the school board because the one thing they would not budge on was the bathroom use. They would not let him use the boys' bathroom. But when you threaten litigation, sometimes good things happen. So we sent a demand letter saying you're violating all of these laws, and they allowed him to use the bathroom. So this is just kind of an example of all the different ways that you can advocate for an LGBTQ youth in education settings. This is an example of the demand letter if anybody wants to use the language. Do we have any questions? Yes?
So, I know one thing you had mentioned up there was mental health for these children. So, what's being done to, let me just kind of an example. So, we had a kid, one of our cases, he was born female, he self-identified as male. We had a whole host of problems, we had a psychological
Right.
Like, I just want help.
Right.
He kept asking for help. So when we tried to replace some of the females, they would say things like, well, he wouldn't feel comfortable.
Right.
So then when we tried to replace the male programs, they're like, well, we don't want the boys to feel uncomfortable.
Right.
So what's being done to help those children that really do need those mental health services?
Well, there's a lot of things that should be being done. What's being done is a different question. But, you know, in cases like that, having a mental health provider that specializes in transition-related care, even if we can't find the perfect placement for the kid, the perfect group home, the perfect foster home, having a therapist or counselor, mental health provider that specializes in that can fill so many gaps and needs, and really just leaving it to the youth to say where they feel most comfortable. It's not about the comfort levels necessarily of the other kids, unfortunately, or whatever. Having the youth, you know, placed in a place where they feel comfortable and they feel safe is most important.
But I also think the thing you run into is some of these places are privately funded.
Right,
So,
right. There are issues that you guys face with the dependency system that I can't even pretend to understand. I know there's so many barriers.
Talk about conservative area.
Right. Right, right, and that you run into a lot of, some of these incredible organizations that provide services and placements are faith-based and they're doing great work, but this specific population is really being harmed by some of that, you know, that rhetoric. So it's a balancing act trying to find the right place for them. Yeah.
I have a quick question about gender dysphoria.
Uh-huh.
You know, we were going through it. It is a diagnosis, okay, for purposes of coding, I'm sure. So
Right.
but what are they treating? Because essentially, are they
Right.
treating the symptoms?
So they're exactly. So with gender dysphoria, the diagnosis, they are not treating you being transgender. They are not trying to change or fix anything. They're not treating that. They're treating the symptoms of your gender dysphoria, which are clinically significant levels of depression, anxiety, psychological distress, etc. So yeah. That's,
Why the gender dysphoria? Because all the other kids can be treated for the same thing.
That's a great question. And many trans youth are diagnosed with anxiety or depression or, you know, bipolar disorder. There's a range of, not bipolar disorder, I don't know why I said that. There are a range of symptoms of not having your gender identity affirmed that can be diagnosed in and of themselves on their own. But gender dysphoria is a clinical diagnosis that individuals who do seek hormone replacement therapy and surgeries and things like that, oftentimes having a diagnosis of gender dysphoria is required before they can receive those services. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think California allows the change of the gender on birth certificate. How young of a person, in your experience, has done that and read any case law?
I've helped a 4-year-old update her parents update her birth certificate from male to female. Yeah. Well, from male to female. Currently, Florida does not have the X or U or non-binary gender marker. We're working on it. I think 9 states have the non-binary gender marker for their driver's licenses. I'm not sure about birth certificates. We just got the birth certificate policy to allow changing from male to female and female to male, so we're like, one step at a time. Yeah, it's Florida. Yeah.
Back in the 90s, there was a rash of mental health issues revolving around sexual abuse. I mean, it got to a point where there were a lot of kids seeing psychiatrists and being diagnosed and hospitalized and treated, and then come to find out it wasn't true. It was considered a repressed memory kind of thing. And I'm seeing an inordinate amount of kids that are around 14 and 15 who are not really fitting in, and parents allowing them to have their breasts removed. For an example, on a girl, a total mastectomy at the age of 17, started her on hormones at 15 or 16, and always been a girly girl, but now has a boy's name, a hairy back, no breasts, and a vagina, and is going off to college. And it's a very tight-knit family where the trans child has cared for an older brother with autism, and so has been kind of your buddy.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of get how all of this has evolved, but my concern is with so many kids doing this at such a young age and finding surgeons who don't recommend therapy first, but just go ahead and do these surgeries. when these kids get to be 24 and 34, they may feel differently about their bodies. What's been done?
So I've been doing trans rights work for going on 2 years now, and I've worked with a lot of different individuals, and I've never heard of a single case of a person under 18 having any surgery that I've worked with. And in fact, the WPATH standards of care do not recommend anything like that. They require, in fact, it's almost what they require is really onerous and burdensome. You need a year of psychological counseling. I don't know of any doctor that would ever do surgery without a year of psychological counseling, and then 6 months of hormone therapy. And before you can even start hormones, you have to prove financial stability, because going on and off hormones can lead to heart attacks and all sorts of things. And then after 6 months to a year of hormone therapy, then you have to be recommended by a medical professional for a surgery. And typically, I haven't seen a surgeon that will perform a surgery on a youth. So if that is happening, I have not heard about it. Okay. That seems like a unique situation that does not reflect most youth's experiences. And the thing is people are like, oh, well, what if we update their name and their gender marker because they really truly do believe that they are a male stuck in a female's body, and then they change their mind. Then change their name and gender marker back. No harm, no foul. But what you did was you assured that that child was not going to commit suicide or end up one of these statistics because of their gender identity not being affirmed. So I'm not advocating for 6-year-olds having surgery or even 14-year-olds having surgery, but allowing someone to socially transition and respecting and affirming the gender that they identify with, it is so important, because the statistics of suicide and depression and mental psychological distress are so egregious. Right.
Because they were so convinced in their mind that this would fix their problems.
Right.
So it's very sad.
Are there any other questions?
I have a question. If you have a youth and they are not necessarily comfortable with, everyone knowing how they identify, yet still you believe that they're telling that they do need an IEP or 504 to help them with their accommodations, how is that necessarily handled in that situation?
If they need an IEP or 504 plan because of their gender dysphoria or the distress they're facing, but they don't want anyone to know, I think that's when you involve the youth in that decision and you weigh the pros and cons. So if we don't update your legal name, or we don't update your name and your gender marker in the system, you're going to keep being dead named. Your teacher's going to keep calling you by this name that you don't identify with. You're not going to be able to use, the bathroom that you identify with. But if we do that, people will know. So I think that that's just a very personal decision that youth has to really weigh the benefits and pros and cons of making that decision. Anybody else? All right, thank you guys so much for coming.